Welcome and good afternoon if you're in Australia, good evening if you're in America, and good morning. Let's just cover the whole of the rest of the world in case they're watching, Don. My name is Sue Turnbull, and by day I'm Professor of Communication and Media at the University of Wollongong, and by night I'm an avid crime reader and reviewer for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. And it's my delight to be here today on behalf of Dymocks talking to Don Winslow. But before I introduce Don, let me just explain how we're going to run this session. Don and I are going to talk for about half an hour. Then we're going to open for questions from you. And we didn't have a prize to start with, but Don and I were talking beforehand, and we've agreed that we're going to give a prize to the best question or the most interesting question in a perfectly arbitrary and personal kind of way. And Don will send you a book. So we're going to have 10 minutes of questions, and then we'll wrap up and move on. So that's how we're going to go. So let me introduce Don Winslow. The New York Times calls him simply the greatest. He's the author of some 21 crime novels. And we're going to be talking very specifically about this collection of novels, short novels, as I think they're described. But before we get to that, if you haven't read Don's biography on his website, I suggest that you do, because it is this extraordinary story of someone who started in one place thinking they were going to do one thing and go to university and do journalism, and then ended up in Africa, and then ended up in Kenya, and then ended up as a private detective, and then ended up directing Shakespeare in Oxford. There's an extraordinary kind of breadth here, and I wanted to ask Don, what of all that led him to write crime, and what was the best preparation that he could have had for the job that he's got now?
I don't want to be glib, but I would say all of it, Sue. You know, nobody stamps your passport to be a writer. You know what I mean? If you get a medical degree, you're a doctor, a law degree, you're a lawyer, but there is no path like that for a writer, particularly a crime writer. And so I knew I wanted to write from a very, very young age, but I needed to make a living. I needed to do things. And so I tried to do things that were interesting and fun to make a living while I was on the way to becoming a writer.
But you also worked as a private detective.
Yeah. I started in Times Square in New York before Mickey Mouse got there, when it was still all crack vials and gunplay and all of that. Started off making low-level drug buys, working pickpockets. Then I graduated to finding runaways before the pimps did, or sometimes after the pimps did. I returned to that later in life when I needed to make money, but on sort of a higher level, mostly in California, doing arson investigation, homicides, frauds, all kinds of different things.
So what was the breakthrough moment when you could finally stop doing all that other stuff and settle down and be a writer? What got you there?
It was a Friday afternoon, and I remember it distinctly. I was, I think, 6 or 7 published books into my career before I could quit those jobs. And although I didn't quit directing Shakespeare for probably 10 years after that, simply because I loved it so much. You know, it was a wonderful thing to do and so much fun. But I wrote a book called The Death and Life of Bobby Z, mostly to entertain myself. And I was writing it on a train. I was commuting between Orange County, which is about an hour and 10 minutes by train south of downtown Los Angeles, California. And I was working on a very long-term case, a murder arson case up in LA. So I'd write a chapter going up on the train and a chapter going back, because I found it's more amusing to write a book on a train than it is to read a book on a train. I never thought anything would happen with that book, and it got sold to the movies on a Friday afternoon, and then to a major publisher the following Monday, and that changed my life. It let me become a full-time writer.
That's a great story. So let's go to Broken, because I've reviewed this book and I just think it's brilliant. And I think it's wonderful because it's a perfect introduction to so much of your other work. It sits on top of it and reflects your range altogether. And I know it's a cliche, but I can't help but describe it as an emotional roller coaster, because I cried, I laughed, I cried, I got upset, I got cross, I got happy. You know, a whole gamut of emotions in that book, and I've been recommending it to people who haven't met your work before and encountered your work. But I have to tell them that they've got to get past the first story, because in some ways that's the most confronting. So I wanted to ask you why you put Broken, which is the name of that story, right at the front.
Yeah, you know, I thought of this collection of novellas sort of like a jazz album. Do you remember albums? Some of us do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and they played different songs, but there was a theme, just like there is to a jazz album or even a single jazz composition, jazz tune, that you start off with a definite theme that's very strong and has strong chords and a strong main line. And you know you're going to end on similar chords. And in the middle, you're going to play different kinds of tunes. You're going to play ballads. You're going to play a little swing. You know. And so I was very deliberate about the order of the stories in this. I wanted to start with Broken, which is a tough story about revenge. I wanted to examine what's the emotional cost of revenge. And what does revenge do to us? What does that search for revenge? Where does that bring us? That's what I wanted to write about. And I wanted to write about being broken. You know, I don't think that anybody involved in the world of crime, whether it's a cop or a criminal or lawyers or journalists, writers, come out of that world unbroken. You know, and so that set the theme for, you know, really every story in the collection. And so that's why I started with that story.
Oh, well, of course, I wanted to ask you, you know, what instrument do you play? And I have a feeling it might be the saxophone. I don't know.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I do. I play sax so badly. You know, listen, I'm terrible. I suck. I go into the back farthest room of the house by myself and shut the doors and the windows and play.
Yeah, because I could hear this book to a saxophone. There you go. That's what I knew. There are other stories in this collection, and as you've described it, I completely get that shape to it as well. But what also intrigued me were the dedications, because we've got a number of dedications. There's one to Mr. Steve McQueen, a story dedicated to him, the Crime 101, I believe, the Raymond Chandler, Sunset, and then Elmore Leonard. And I wanted to know what the connection was between those various people that you've identified, two of them being crime authors and one an actor.
Yeah, heroes. You know, I think, look, McQueen defined California cool, defined American cool for a generation, my generation of film goers. When you look at his youth, he had a really Dickensian childhood. Dickens could have written Steve McQueen's childhood, and probably would have if he was a 1970s screenwriter. You know, and as you know, I mean, English lit is a big influence on me, and so it was fun to give a nod to Steve McQueen, because in so many ways he personified a kind of a cultural biome that I exist in as a writer quite a bit. I write about that a lot. And then I thought, well, that would be fun, just fun, to have a character who modeled himself after Steve McQueen, just very deliberately. And what would that look like, and what would that do to a story? So it was just fun to do, and to give a nod to I think a terrific actor.
Yes, and the Pacific Highway, which obviously you know extremely well, that's a character in that story as well. I love that.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, you know, I fell in love with the Pacific Coast Highway the first time I drove it. Came out from the East Coast on a case, and had an unexpected day off. And I don't know what to do. I'll get in the car, you know, and drive. And I found myself on this highway that I've been in love with ever since. I never get tired of driving that thing. I've lived on it. I've been on it 1,000 times, Sue, and I'm always excited. It always turns me on. You know, it has all these small gods of place that are very evocative for me. And so to take the sort of pun, you know, which is kind of a silly pun, Crime 101, i.e. a textbook on crime, but also to place it on the 101, which is the number of the Pacific Coast Highway, and then to have Steve McQueen driving it. I
Yeah.
couldn't resist. Yeah.
Yeah. I could tell you were having such fun in that story, you know, setting off the crook who is a very sophisticated, you're right, totally cool crook, and the dogged policeman who follows him and is going through his own marriage problems and all the rest of it. You make both of them totally endearing.
Thank you. You know, the cop who's having marriage problems, I've never had marriage problems. I've been very happily married for 35 years, but my wife and I were remodeling our house and had to move. And I thought, if I'm moving for a while, it's going to be to the beach. So I moved into the condo that Lou Lubeznik moves into in that story without my wife, who was off taking care of some family health issues in the Midwest. And I felt like this middle-aged, you know, sort of pathetic divorce guy thinking he was going to become this beach swinger, you know, when I moved in. That's how people looked at you, you know, like you're kind of pathetic. So
yeah. I love that story. And what about, I mean, it's not surprising to see a dedication to Raymond Chandler, but what was the connection between the Chandler dedication and the story Sunset?
Yeah. Listen, without Chandler, we don't exist, our genre, you know. And if I write for another 100 years, I'll never write anything 100th as good as The Long Goodbye. And I think, you know, when you get a chance to do it, it's nice. It feels good to pay homage to your heroes and to people who are a big influence on you, you know. If you read Chandler out loud, it's poetry. What a lot of people don't realize, there's no reason they should actually, is that the house that the main character in that story inhabits, from which he's watching sunset, is based on Chandler's actual house. And I'm always taunting my LA friends that Chandler wrote all of his great LA noir novels while living in San Diego, which was, of course, a wise choice.
Okay, I'm hoping that you can't hear the helicopter going above me at the moment, but we're near a beach, and sometimes the helicopters go over when there's a beach rescue or something. So I'm just hoping you can't hear that. But
that's fine.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
But let's then go to Elmore Leonard, because so many crime writers revere Elmore Leonard, and it's quite hard to explain that to people who haven't read Elmore. But give us your version of Elmore and why that story.
Oh my gosh! You know, look, when I was a young guy, which obviously I'm not anymore, and thinking about doing this thing, you know, this thing of ours, I was reading Elmore Leonard and thinking, man, if I could tell stories like that, if I could write like that, of course I haven't and I can't, nobody can. But he was my model. Do you know what I mean? He was the inspiration. He was the guy. And I learned, I mean, I imitated him. I'll be very direct about it. You know, my early books, you imitate Elmore Leonard, Mr. Leonard, and learn from what he had to say about writing. I once was at a book event in my first book in my career, and I was with Elmore Leonard for 2 hours and couldn't work up the nerve to go up and say hello. You know, I was that much in awe and that shy. And then later, many decades later, I had the chance to be on the phone with him. We were going to do a movie together. I was going to write the screenplay for his classic novel, Unknown Man '89. And my agent, Shane Salerno, got us on the phone together. The most magical hour of my life, you know. Mr. Leonard got on the phone, and the first thing he said was, "Don Winslow, you were 2 years old when I wrote 310 to Yuma." It was the most charming way of putting me in my place, you know. And I said, "Yes, sir," but I tried to read it. And then he laughed, and then he just told us stories for an hour.
Yes.
You know, Hollywood stories and writer stories, and it was just great. And we never got to make the film for some complicated reasons, and he passed all too shortly after that. It was an honor to be able to dedicate something to Mr. Leonard.
Leonard, of course, was a great stylist in many ways. I mean, and I think this book, The Winter of Frankie Machine, I think the opening to that book is very much your homage to kind of a Leonard approach to something. But taking this notion of style, I do want to talk about craftsmanship, because you make it look so easy, but it isn't, right?
Right.
Well, it is really hard to make it look that simple. It's like the Dolly Parton, excuse. It
Mhm.
takes an awful lot of money to look this,
Look
or
cheap.
whatever
Yeah.
it was.
Right.
And but it takes so much effort to look so spare. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Listen, I mean, I probably do 10 to 14 drafts of any given chapter, any given book. I'm constantly rewriting. And one remembers things that Leonard said,
Mm.
you know, and wrote about our craft.
Mm.
One of the most valuable to me, I think it's made my career really, is skip the boring bits. If something's boring, just skip over it. You don't have to take everyone through every step
Mm.
of the story. If A is interesting and D is interesting and B and C are boring, skip them. And I think that's part of developing that spare style. But I also will go back and look at a sentence or a chapter and think, you really don't need that word.
Mm.
My philosophy on it is that every word needs to pay rent, or at least it needs to take out the garbage or do the dishes. You know what I mean? But it just can't live in the house for free. And so just this morning, in fact, I was going through something and looking, going, that word's not doing anything.
Yeah.
It's not setting the table. It's not doing the groceries. It's doing nothing, and it has to go.
But I've also, I think, read or heard somewhere that you are also very conscious of the layout of what your prose looks like on the page, how it appears to the reader.
Yeah.
And that's something that I'm very conscious of as an academic when I'm writing academic articles, or any kind of writing, is how it looks, how accessible it is.
We tend to forget that reading is also a visual activity, and it needs to look like what it is.
Mm.
So sometimes, and this sounds crazy, I always hesitate to say this, but I don't want to lie to you, is that sometimes I'll step back from the screen until I cannot see words, but I can see shapes.
Mm-hmm.
And then I ask myself, does the shape look like what it's supposed to be?
Mm-hmm.
If it's an action sequence and I want to grab the reader and not let him or her go until I'm done with it, then it needs to look dense. It needs to look more black on the page than white. But sometimes you want to focus the reader's attention, eye or ear or mind or heart, on one small image or one word or two words or something. And in which case you want to leave a lot of white space, so the eye just goes right to that. So it needs to look like what it's supposed to be. Sorry for the length.
Let's talk a little bit more now about the characters, because what's another lovely aspect of Broken is that we're re-encountering quite a few of your characters in what I now am going to call the Winslow verse, right? Don Winslow's created this parallel world, which is just like ours, possibly nicer, possibly fairer, possibly a little more artistically rounded. But you love these characters. They go on. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the really fun things about doing Broken was the ability to go back to some of these characters that readers ask me about all the time. Whatever happened to this guy, whatever happened to her, or what, where are they? And I was almost embarrassed too, because sometimes I'd be writing one of these novellas and realize, oh yeah, I left this character in that same location at that time.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't remember that. And then I thought, okay, well, that's kind of fun. So what? What would happen if these people met? Would they be friends? Would they be enemies? Would they get involved? Would they ignore each other? What would it be like to update them and make them play with each other? So that was a lot of fun. Yeah.
So these stories were written all at the same time. I mean, it's not like you wrote them over a long period of time. You've just done this as a concept.
Yeah. Some of the ideas had very roughly in my mind for years.
Mm.
And I knew that they weren't, that heavy kind of epic that I've been standardly writing for the last 20 years. Yeah. But they weren't short stories either. They were in that middle distance, that middle way. But no, really, other than having a line or two here or there, or part of a character maybe in mind, I just sat down and started typing and see where it went.
We've got a comment that's just popped up, which says from someone who said it was great to catch up with Neil Carey again.
Oh, yeah,
He's the
thank you.
character in, is it Sunset? Yeah, he's the character in Sunset who is the English professor. And I have to tell you that I hadn't met Neil Carey before, but I loved the fact that he was a Smollett scholar. And in fact, Tobias Smollett plays a significant role, because I've never come across a crime novel that featured Tobias Smollett. When I was at university, I read all of Smollett, The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, you know, the whole gamut.
Roderick Random.
I never thought about them again. And here I am reading a Don Winslow, and Tobias Smollett pops up.
Yeah, well, I started my career with that, you know, with this character Neil Carey, who was trying to be a academic in 18th century English lit, because a buddy of mine, Jim Basker at Barnard, professor of English lit there, was a Smollett scholar. And he turned me on to Smollett, and it occurred to me that in many ways the crime novel of our era, particularly noir, is the picaresque novel of our times. There's so many similarities, you know, about the underworld and the search for identity, and young people in tough situations trying to find their way through a difficult, dangerous world. A lot of similarities, really. And so that's what I first modeled my work after, was Tobias Smollett.
Yes, I love that allusion. And the characters, I mean, to me, you also have that breadth, that humanity that Elmore Leonard had, where even the bad guys, they've got a backstory and you start to feel sorry for them. I mean, the character of Hollis Bamberger, who appears in the San Diego Zoo, the stupidest guy ever born. I just felt for Hollis all the way through. So you do love your bad guys too, most of the time, right?
I do, you know, and I try very hard not to, listen, I don't want to be objective when I'm writing a character. That's not my job. My job is to bring the reader into that world as closely as I can. And typically the way I choose to do that is to see that world through those characters' eyes. So if I sort of step back and put my own moral judgment on it, they turn into silhouettes, they turn into cartoons, you know. So I'm not thinking good or bad or right or wrong. I'm just trying to get into that character's head, see the world, you know, through their experience, and go with it.
Which you do, and you make it so vivid for us. And I'm coming to the last story in the collection, which is called The Last Ride. And here you've got a guy who's working along the Mexican border, and he's a guy who voted for Trump. And you put that in very clearly, but did not vote for what has resulted, which is, you know, the crux of that story is encountering a child that's been taken from a mother in a cage, as it were. And this brings us to politics, because there is a very strong political message in all of your stories underlying these themes. So this matters to you a great deal, right?
Sure. You know, I don't know that it's a matter of politics anymore. I think it's a matter of decency. It's a matter of morality. It's a matter of humanity. And that, you know, this is that story really is a neo-Western. Speaking of Elmore Leonard, you know, started by writing Westerns. And I was trying to harken back to an older Western code where we rescued kids. We didn't chuck them in cages. We would have done anything to save them. You know, I live in a very conservative area, although I'm you know, more to the left myself. But most of my neighbors are conservative ranchers, rock-ribbed Republicans who are equally disgusted as I am, you know, by what I see and what's going on, and how basically indecent, and I would like to think un-American that is.
Well, you've spent, you know, there's the three books that you've written, The Power of the Dog, The Cartel, and The Border. They've been described, I think it was James Ellroy who'd called them the War and Peace of dope books. Somebody called it the Game of Thrones of the Mexican drug wars. You know, you've written these huge books. I think the most recent one is sitting in over 700 pages. This was a mammoth undertaking. It's taken you 20 years to do this. Are you going to Are you going to do anything on that scale again, or are you?
We shall see. I'm not ready to sort of come out in public with what I'm doing next, but it wouldn't surprise me.
Right. Oh, okay. You might take something else on.
Might do. Don't know yet. We'll see. But yeah, I wouldn't be shocked.
No.
Yeah, that trilogy that you kindly alluded to was a third of my life.
Yeah.
I've spent more time with Art Keller, the main character of that book, with the exception of my wife and son, than any other real human being in my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad that I did it. I was satisfied with it, I think.
Yeah.
But I need to move on and do other things.
And has that trilogy been optioned for a television series or a film? It has, hasn't it?
It has. It's in the process now. Yeah, on FX network. I've done a lot of great TV series, so I'm very excited about it. What I particularly am excited about is that they're really taking the time and the leisure and the care to show more of Mexican society and Mexican people than just narco traffickers.
Mm-hmm.
And so major characters are, social workers, women doctors who are extraordinarily courageous in this era, priests, artists, journalists, poets, to give a sort of, a deservedly rich picture of that culture and that country.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary oeuvre, if I can use that wonderful word, and it is epic in scale. I mean, you once you're into that world, I actually felt quite bereft when I left it between books, and couldn't wait to go back in. And I've just had that thing happen again, which is that my screen has gone blank again, which shouldn't happen. But I'm just going to type myself back in, and
sleep on you.
Yeah, so we need to go to questions. So while we're doing that, can while I'm coming back into presence, Don, can you spot a question there that you might want to answer? Yes, I'm back. Here we go.
I see one from my pal Dervla McTiernan.
Oh, good.
Hi, Derv. How I pick titles. I wish I knew. I think it's the hardest damn thing to do, and I wish we could just number the books. It's extraordinarily difficult to pick titles. So, Dervla, you pick great ones. So if you have any tips for me, please, you have my number. Give me a call. Let's see.
Okay, well, have we got another question there yet? We're just.
They're not so much questions as they are comments, and they're extraordinarily kind. Yeah.
Let's go back there. Sue Bobbermines thought that Broken is your concept album. There you go. She's picked up on the musical allusion.
She might be right. Listen, I was paying a lot of attention to music when both writing those and then putting them together. I had a definite kind of musical scheme in mind, and I knew that I was going to be maybe both praised and condemned for them being also different, for playing different songs. But that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted out of the jazz of it. I wanted to be able to play hard bop and ballads and swing and have it blend into one album.
Well, maybe you should do what Michael Connolly did with Trunk Music and release a little concept album to accompany the book. That'd
be fun. I hope everyone's paying attention. That'd be great. Yeah, let's do that. I'd love to. Yeah.
We've got another question there from Jay Dwight, which says, how extensive and intensive was the research over the years for the Cartel trilogy?
Yeah. I think that the first book in that trilogy took me 5.5 to 6 years to write, and 3 years of that was research.
Yeah.
I didn't write at all. I just read and went out in the field and interviewed people and took notes. And the notes from that, which I always destroy within a certain number of months after the book comes out, filled a room.
Right.
So I have a very particular way I like to do research. I'm a geek, for one thing. I love doing research. I'm a real nerd. I'm very, very happy, prowling shelves and all that kind of stuff. But I like to read history first, and then journalism,
Mm.
and documents like, court records, police reports, CIA reports. And then when I think I have enough base knowledge not to be a nuisance or not to waste people's time, then I go out in the field and I talk to people and I interview people. I never bring a notebook. I never bring a tape recorder. I leave all that stuff behind and just have conversations and just try to listen and observe and watch. And so that's really kind of how I like to do it. But yeah, the research on those 3 books was extraordinarily intense. For the Cartel, it was brutal. You're writing about a particularly vicious and sadistic era in the war on drugs, and the research for it was soul killing.
Right, we've got questions popping up here very fast and thick here. Karina, oh, we've got one there. Dean, I have to. Hi Don, I loved California Fire and Life, especially the killer details that bring it to life. What do you like to see in a great ending?
Yeah, I don't want to be glib, and it's a serious question. Truth. Truth. It's funny. I can think of 3 or 4 books, that one included, where I originally wrote the wrong ending to it, and then going back to it weeks later, realized it. Just clanged. I forget who it was that said, someone out there will probably remind me that an ending should be both surprising and inevitable.
Yes.
And I used to think that was contradictory. Again, I learned through jazz that it wasn't. That you start off with a chord, and if you don't end with the right chord, it's unsatisfying. That's inevitable. But the notes you play to get to that resolving chord should be surprising. That's how I learned to deal with that. But really what I want out of an ending is truth. That feels right to the character. Do you know what I mean? And it's not cheating the story. And again, there have been times when I'll be very honest with you, I've chickened out on what should have been the right ending. And then had to go back and go, yeah, no, dude, you got to go back and you have to tell the truth.
I think it was Elmore Leonard who finished Get Shorty with the famous last line, "Fucking endings, man, they're hard."
Great, yeah. Endings and character names are brutal. Again, I wish we could just number them. I hate writing character names.
Oh, well, Hollis Bamberger's got to be one of my absolute favorites.
I have a fondness for Hollis, and I don't know why.
Oh, he's just wonderful. The Cartel trilogy has been optioned, and it's easy to see why. How's The Winter of Frankie Machine? This is a question from Trevor Blaney. He says, it was my favorite.
I don't know if you heard my wife laughing in the background about the Frankie Machine. There's a now famous story about that. It was originally optioned by Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro, and was headed for the big screen. And then Eric Roth, the wonderful screenwriter and wonderful guy from whom I have enormous respect and affection, sent De Niro a book for research to play Frankie Machine, a book called You Paint Houses, Don't You? And they liked that book better. And they ended up not making Frankie Machine, but making You Paint Houses, Don't You? Into a quite wonderful film called The Irishman. So that's a story about that. Stay tuned, though, is the actual answer to your question. Right. There are things happening right now. I don't know if I'm at liberty to talk about them, so I probably shouldn't.
Probably shouldn't, no. But it's always fun casting, when you're reading a crime novel, casting the people that you think you would love to see play the part.
Yeah, you play that game. Yeah, I never think about it when I'm writing, because I think only bad things could happen. I ended up writing a lousy screen treatment or a lousy novel. So I never think about it or think about actors. But it is fun to speculate. It's fun when really wonderful actors are interested in your stuff.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, we've got a question here from Anna Valdinger, who says, Force is such an interesting exploration of corruption and the police. What is your perspective on the difficult role they're playing in society? And yes, we've been having a lot of debates here in Australia about the future of police procedurals on television. you know,
absolutely.
following the whole Black Lives Matter and
Yeah.
recent events.
It's such a long and complicated topic. Is there systemic racism in police? Obviously, of course there is. But I think sometimes it's a mistake to focus exclusively on police
Mm.
because they don't come from Mars. You know, they come from the same well that the rest of us do. So if there's systemic racism in police forces, it's because there's systemic racism in society as a whole.
Yeah.
Now, the way that we police now exacerbates that problem
Mm.
because we police by response. So when cops go in, they only go in when bad things happen.
Mm.
And so psychologically, they tend to believe the worst of people. Is there corruption among the police? Certainly, absolutely, and I've written it about in the force and elsewhere. Having said all that, I think I can't speak to the Australian situation because I'm not an expert on it. I know nothing about it. But in the American situation, we ask our police to do too much and to be too much. You know, we created a war on drugs that was worse than futile and asked the police to fight that. So much of their time goes into that. We have destroyed our own mental health and public health system. And so the police are now the de facto mental health providers for society. They cannot do all that. So when people now are talking about defunding the police, what they're really talking about, I hope, is to give back responsibilities to agencies and individuals who are better able to perform them. And to get back to sort of the community policing model where a cop is in that neighborhood all the time and knows the people. And I'll give you one last word in this. I know I get preachy about it, but it's a complicated question, and thank you for it. The real job of a street cop is to please his or her sergeant or lieutenant. So it all comes down to leadership. If a sergeant and lieutenant says, you won't do that stuff, whether it's racial abuse or corruption, that stuff will not be done.
Yeah. In Broken, you give us a very lovely young policeman, though, in that wonderful story, The San Diego Zoo. He's just a delight. He's the policeman who's trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
A smart guy, wants to work in homicide. So you give us both sides, I think.
I try. You know, I think balance has become a dirty word, oddly enough. When I was starting out as a young journalist, it was a good word. Now it's not so much. I do try to give balance. You know, I do try to show that this is a big spectrum and there are a lot of ends to it. You know, we need to look at police brutality and we need to picture it, and I do. We need to look at corruption. We can also look at those cops, and there are many of them who are just out there trying to do a good job.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, we've got another one from Karina Kilmore, author, who says, do you keep your politics separate to your writing? I'm a big follower of your politics and writing. So
thank you.
Follow her on Twitter there.
Yeah. You know, I never wanted to be a political person, ever. And I still don't want to be. I just wanted to tell stories. That's what I've wanted to do all my life. However, having said that, Karina, these are extraordinary times. And I think that these times force one to be a political person. I think that it's incumbent upon us who have a little bit of a public voice. I don't have a large one, you know, not a big deal, but a little bit of a public voice, and particularly around the time a book comes out, more so than at other times, to speak out. You know, I think these elections that are coming up in the United States in November are the most important elections that we've had since before our Civil War. I feel that seriously about it. I think that our democracy is at stake. I think that we are creeping toward fascism with the current administration. And so I think that's forced me to be political. And also, I guess it's the subjects I write about, you know, having spent 23 years in the war on drugs, I think that's politicized me to a certain extent. And I think if I didn't maybe speak out, all I would be is a voyeur. And that would be kind of unbearable.
But I think what comes through Broken, to come back to those short stories, is that you do actually believe in human decency and in good people. That even people who do the wrong thing politically, are redeemable if they do the right thing.
Many of them. I wouldn't say all of them. I wouldn't say all of them. Yeah, listen, at the end of the day, listen, I'm a skeptic, and I think some people would call me a cynic, and I think it's true that all cynics are disappointed idealists and romantics. So yeah, I think I do believe in basic human decency. Because I see it a lot,
Yeah.
This winter, I live in a remote area, quite near the border. It's high elevation,
Yeah.
and it's an area that immigrants try to cross, unfortunately. And this winter, 3 of them died in one event. 3 women out of 5 who got lost in these very heavily wooded mountains, and I was talking about these ranchers who live around me, who are very conservative, and we disagree about almost everything. There's no doubt in my mind, though, that if those guys had known those women were out there, as nobody did, they would have been on their horses out there risking their lives to try to rescue them. There's no doubt in my mind.
Okay, and that's very much the moral of The Last Ride too, isn't it? That's that final story.
Yeah.
So we've got a question here from John. It's interesting. You put your glasses on to read, and I take them off. So here we go. One of the stories in Broken revisits some old characters from your previous books. What made you revisit these characters, and will we see any of them again? Well, we've sort of touched on that already a little bit, John. But you're going to come back to them?
Maybe. Never say never. Listen, I didn't think I was ever coming back to them for this book. The opportunity presented itself, and it seemed like fun, and it seemed organic. It didn't feel forced, and so it was fun to do, and it was fun to hang out with those cats again, So never say never, John. Maybe. I don't know.
Okay, and we got last question coming up. Okay, we've got the last one coming. While we're waiting for that one to oh, here it is. We've got it. Sudha. I hope I've said that correctly. Love your work and love Broken. When's the next book due? Yes, that's the right question, Sudha.
Thank you, Sudha. Thanks for that question and the compliment. I appreciate it more than you could know. I don't know is the answer to that. It won't be this coming year, but probably soon after that. I've been going at it pretty hard without a break for the last about 25 years now. And so I'm still writing every morning, and I'm on the road right now. This background you see is a motel room. Stay tuned. It'll be coming sooner than many of us think.
We're all going to be looking forward to that. And, really. And meanwhile, I'm going backwards. I started rereading Frankie Machine, and I just loved it so much. And I thought, I've forgotten so much of this. I have to go back. And when I hit the onion bagel in here.
Yay, onion bagel.
So for those of you who haven't read either, you need to know about onion and egg bagels.
Onion and egg bagel sandwiches, the best. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a thing. So, Don, thank you. Now, we need to pick a question, and I'm going to actually nominate, if I may, on your behalf, Anna Valdinger's question about the police as being the question that produced a very complex and interesting answer. And maybe Anna can send us her details, and you can send her a book.
I think I have Anna's details, and I will send her a book. I think she probably has some, but maybe one with my autograph on it.
Oh, that's lovely.
And if you come up with anyone else from here, just let me know. We'll get that done.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, look, Don, thank you so much. Such wonderful answers, and been such a pleasure to spend time with you in the Winslow verse.
This has been just a fun conversation. Thanks for the great questions. I've just enjoyed talking with you. Talking, it's just been fun for me. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody, for coming in and spending time with us. And get hold of Broken if you haven't already. Revisit the Winslow oeuvre and look forward to the next book. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you all very much.